Dr. John Peterson. Herzlich willkommen to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Peterson, you've wrote this new book, The Essence des Seins. It will be out the next days here in Germany, and it's about identity. You're now visiting Germany. Germany is a country in, I would say, identity crisis. What is your analysis of Germany? What is your view on Germany and Western Europe these days?
Well, Germany in particular is still, what would you say, living through the throes of historical guilt and trying to come to terms with that. You see that in the West quite broadly with its guilt with regard to, say, colonial past, which is an analog of the guilt that Germany as a society bears for what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s. That's a very difficult thing to sort out. You know, what responsibility do you take for the cataclysms of the past? There's obviously a guilt that goes along with that, a survivor's guilt, an unworthy beneficiary guilt. And I would also say that the psychopathic radicals of the narcissistic left are unbelievably good at exploiting that. And it really works for conservative types in particular because they tend to be guilt prone. And so what do we do with our past? That's part of identity,
yes.
Right? And if your relationship with your past is disjointed, then you're going to be disjointed psychologically, and you're going to be disjointed with regard to your representation of the future. And so that makes you hopeless and confused in an anxiety-provoking manner and also disunited. And so we see that everywhere in the West, probably most acutely in Germany. So what is the pathway forward? Well, how do you atone for your sins, even your hereditary sins, let's say, to the degree that those exist, the sins that are visited upon the children for 7 generations, let's say? And the answer to that,
it seems
you
it's
live
going
in
the
a
other
manner
way.
that decreases the probability that such things are going to happen again in the future. And that's key to identity. You know, I spent a lot of time studying the Holocaust, a lot of time. And I studied the worst elements of it that I could find, trying to extract out the moral. Well, the moral of the story is something like, don't be the sort of person that sits by idly when such things are occurring. Okay, but that's not some simple political command. It's not exactly even a characterological command. It's deeper than that. It starts to touch on what's sacred. You form a sacred alliance with the truth to stop your society from degenerating into hell. Well, that's a much more serious investigation into identity of the sort that's now radically necessary. And that's partly what this book delves into. And so my work, the work I'm doing with the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, is work on identity. And identity, what's the proper identity? We have a culture war about that. What's the proper identity? The worship of my own sexual proclivities? Yeah, I don't think so. The worship of pride? That's a very bad idea. Those two things together, that's the worst possible idea. What's the alternative? Well, that's what we're trying to investigate with the Ark. That's what I'm trying to investigate with this book. And I believe the successful revitalizing revolutions that have occurred time and time again in Western culture have always been radical returns to the tradition, right? And that's a strange juxtaposition, that idea of radical return to the tradition. But I don't see a pathway forward. I don't believe there is a pathway forward other than that. There never has been. There's no reason to assume there would be. I think that's even recognized by unwilling, what would you say, those who might be otherwise unwilling to admit to such a thing. Richard Dawkins came out a month ago and called himself a cultural Christian. Well, there's a reason for that. And partly what I'm doing with this new book, with one I have coming out in November called We Who Wrestle with God, is to address this issue of identity.
It seems to me, talking about Germany and all the things you just mentioned, that a totalitarian past does not really protect you from totalitarian ideas and a totalitarian future, because all the totalitarian ideas, the rise of totalitarian ideas we see right now, it is happening in Germany
again,
especially. And again, I just came here from Berlin and I drove through the city and I saw a building and it had the progressive pride flag on it, but not one flag, but 12 flags hanging next to, as you know, Germans are very thorough with their ideological flags.
Yeah.
Why is that? Like, why does your past and your identity that you've tried, why doesn't it protect you from repeating your words?
Well, partly because we don't, you see, there's been an insistence since the end of the Second World War that we're not to forget what happened, let's say in Auschwitz. We're not to forget that. But the problem is, you see, you can't remember something you don't understand. Well, so then maybe you have an economic theory of the development of totalitarianism, or maybe you have a great man gone wrong theory. So Hitler, you know, what would he deceived and demented the entire population of otherwise freedom-seeking individuals. Maybe you could say the same thing about Stalin and Mao, but those theories are insufficient because totalitarianism isn't a top-down phenomena. It's a thoroughly distributed fractal phenomena. You have a totalitarian state when every single person lies about absolutely everything they say and do every time they open their mouths or think. Right, and so that makes it something much more akin to, well, what's been portrayed classically as a spiritual battle. If you want to eradicate the usurping totalitarian spirit, that's the spirit of Lucifer, by the way, then you do that by putting your own soul in order. And that's been the insistence in the West on the Judeo-Christian side for 5,000 years, and it's right. It's not a political issue. And we like to assume that the problem with totalitarianism is the problem with Caesar, but the problem with Caesar is the problem with Lucifer. And so that's a deeper problem. And people don't like that. It's not surprising, you know. I mean, when I read totalitarian history, I always read it as a perpetrator. That's a very uncomfortable thing to do.
Yes.
Because you think, oh, well, I couldn't enjoy taking someone off a train car where many people have frozen to death in the middle of the winter, isolated from their family, putting a 100-pound bag of wet salt on their backs, having them march from one side of the city, the compound, the camp, to the other and then back again. I couldn't enjoy that. It's like, don't kid yourself. You could enjoy that, not me. It's like, the more you think that, the less likely you are to be helpful when the crunch comes. And the crunch is always coming.
Is it coming right now? Because it seems to me these ideas, these totalitarian concepts seem awfully attractive, especially to young people. Social media seems to have done the smartphone. I have no explanation for it, but you know, something appears to have happened with young people that makes these concepts
I wouldn't say it's young people
attractive.
Exactly. I would say it's a small minority of disinhibited psychopaths. And the problem with social media, one of the problems, is that there is no consequence for being a provocative psychopath online. In fact, quite the contrary. And this is a very bad problem because about, clinically speaking, 3 to 4% of the population at any given time are psychopathic narcissists. Kind of radical form of power-seeking, hedonism-seeking immaturity. It's a good way of conceptualizing it. Now and then those people get the upper hand, and then literally all hell breaks loose. And we're definitely facilitating that online. I don't believe that that's representative of the general population in the least, not least because I'm constantly attacked online. And every single encounter I have in public is positive. Like the disjunction is 100%. You know, I think I've run into 2 or 3 people in the course of my travels who were less than polite, but most of the time it's unbelievably positive. So that's an illusion driven by a small percentage of people, but that doesn't mean it isn't cataclysmically dangerous, because a small percentage of the population can cause an unbelievable amount of trouble and are inclined to, right? They want to dance in the runes. They've partly because they feel that in their unwillingness to make the proper sacrificial offerings, their best path to hedonic gratification and power is to devastate everything and to be the ruler of the runes. That's operating in the back.
And they have global reach now in their hands with the smartphone and social media. Do you think mankind will survive social media? I sometimes feel, looking at young children, that somehow our brains were not ready for that invention. For social media, the smartphone, the constant, you know, the drumbeat, the WhatsApp groups in your, you know, for 8-year-olds. I sometimes think we have mankind has outplayed itself with smartphones.
Well,
one of the
things that we should remember in that regard is that, you know, there weren't smartphones 10 years ago and there probably won't be in 10 years, right? We have no idea where this technological transformation is going to take us. So the deeper question is, can we withstand this rate of technological transformation?
Yeah.
And I would say, well, we have to transform ethically at an equal rate. Are we doing that? We're battling it out, you know, and I don't think that there's a reason to be cataclysmically pessimistic. It's the opportunities are great, and so are the potential catastrophes, and they're coming at us at an ever accelerating rate. Can we manage that? If we want to, if we decide to.
It seems to me that smartphones, social media, the connected world has kind of globalized ideology. You know, coming from Germany, reading history, you know, my impression always was, you know, there were crazy places in history, but you could escape them. You know, you could go to England or, you know, try to make your way to Switzerland or on a boat to the US. But this kind of, this new totalitarianism seems to be everywhere. It's, you know, it's in universities now. It's around the globe. It's, you know, everywhere where there are smartphones. Is it possible that, you know, we're seeing a rise of a new tyranny that is global, that you cannot escape?
Well, I think we could go in that direction. The Chinese have gone in that direction, and they're mapping the route for everyone if we want it. There's certainly a vicious pull in that direction. There's plenty of counter movement. You know, I would say that's probably most evident in the United States. It's probably second most evident, possibly in Great Britain, possibly. We'll see. But in the States, for sure. I mean, it's not as if the globalist totalitarians have won the battle in the United States. In fact, I don't think they have. And I mean, the political divide in the US is very stark, and there are dangers on both sides. But I'm traveling through the United States extensively certainly doesn't fill me with a sense of pessimism. I mean, that place is, the thing about the Americans is that their political structure is so loose that there's always something sane going on somewhere. And that's the case even now, regardless of the fact that the contagion of bad ideas has been facilitated by interconnectivity, right? Which is a real problem.
Yeah.
We know that optimally structured neural networks have a certain degree of connectivity and no more. So there's a certain degree of, let's say, isolation, so neurons can communicate locally, and then they can broadcast their message to other local communicating structures. If you connect everything, you get pathology. If you disconnect everything, you get pathology. What we're working out right now on the technological front is, you know, what is optimal connectivity? Because it's not 100% all the time. And also, how do we inhibit the spread of bad but attractive to the impulsive ideas? Well, we don't know how to do that. Will we sort it out? Yeah. Again, I think it depends on people's fundamental aim. I don't see any reason to assume that we can't use our advanced technological power for good. And we are doing that in many ways. We feed 9 billion people on a regular basis, right? No one would have thought that was possible in the 1960s, and we're managing it. And there's lots of things that are progressing upward. Is there a commensurate risk? The more powerful you get, the more opportunity there is, and the more risk. So, but what that implies is that you have to get your act together, right? Because you're a different kind of actor once you have a cell phone, let's say. You've got more power at your fingertips.
Got more power.
Right. More influence. And so you need to be better. And part of what I outlined in this book and in my work more generally is a pathway to that, which is also a return to the fundamental bedrock of tradition that made Western societies. It's funny, Western societies, because they're predicated on this Judeo-Christian ethos that's not Western, you know, so it's a perverse way of looking at it. But Judeo-Christian societies, the foundation is irreplaceable and correct. And we need to understand why that is and what that means personally in each individual's life. We have to understand that more deeply than we have before.
You just mentioned the US, you just mentioned UK pushing back on this movement. It's not that visible here in Germany. What do you think is the most important thing for conservatives in Germany to understand how to push back in this culture war that you also describe and mention in your book, because conservatives in Germany usually say, we don't want to get engaged in culture wars. We don't even accept that term. That's not what we are. But the other side seems to be very serious about it. So what do you tell them?
Well, conservatives have a proclivity to put their head down and focus on the immediate problems in front of them and try to solve them practically. And that's fine when you're not rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, so to speak. But but the problem is that we are in a culture war, and the conservatives can put their head in the sand all they want with that in that regard. And that'll mean two things. The lefties get the upper hand and win, and the conservatives will just turn into slow motion progressives. Well, that's not helpful, and that is definitely what's happening. And obviously, Rishi Sunak's crew took a major hit recently for exactly that problem. So conservatives tend not to be visionary, and they tend not to be concerned with broader scale ideas. But that isn't an option at the moment. And the lefties are much better at understanding that, much better at it, and then capitalizing
What
on
is
it.
necessary that conservatives finally understand it? Because it doesn't seem to be happening. The biggest and strongest trend in at least German conservatism I observe still is that they want to be liked by the left. That that is what they aim for. They want to be liked by that the culture.
You can't fill a bottomless pit. You can't satisfy people whose fundamental orientation is dissatisfaction. There's no pleasing the left. There's no limit to inclusivity, right? The opposite of a thesis is not...
Should one apologize to the left? In general, should one apologize to the left when they go after you, or is that already suicide?
No, you don't apologize. No, well, look, this is part of the issue with regards to personal identity. If you've made a mistake, you should confess and atone and make the appropriate sacrifices to bring things back together. But if you haven't done anything wrong, then you shouldn't apologize, because that's a lie. Yeah. Now, one of the moral problems that conservatives face is that they are guilt prone. And so, if I go after you for being sexist, I suspect that you can probably bring to mind the odd occasion where you might have been a bit more sexist than would be optimal. Yeah. And the same thing might apply with regards to ethnocentricity and racial preference, for that matter. People have a pronounced in-group preference, and it's very easy to make that into a cudgel of guilt. But it's not helpful. It's not helpful. And one of the things conservatives have to understand is that they've allowed the left to take the moral upper hand.
Yes.
And that's a huge mistake. Like, one of the things we're doing with this ARC organization, this Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, is making the case that one of our more policy-oriented platforms, you might say, is, well, what should we do with the poverty, energy, environment nexus? And the answer to that is, cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for everyone. It'd be lovely if energy was available at 1/4 its current cost. I don't care if it's nuclear or solar or wind or fossil fuel or coal, for that matter. It doesn't matter. All of them likely. And the marketplace can battle it out. Why cheap energy? Well, because there's no difference between that and wealth. Okay, what good is wealth? Well, poor people die without it. How about that being good, especially in the developing world?
Why is the left so oblivious, especially when it comes to the energy debate about poor people dying for not having cheap energy? Why don't they care? Because it seems odd. They are...
It is odd. That's exactly one place where they're unbelievably vulnerable. It's like, oh, I see. So you'll sacrifice the actual poor to your delusional utopia 100 years hence. Oh, absolutely. It's like, yeah, well, that's what they did in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
That's what they did in Mao's China. Who cares about today's poor? We're building the glorious tomorrow. Wind. Well, in the future, you can just be satisfied with the hell that's being visited upon you now. It's like, no, cheap energy. But there's also an environmental side to that, because the data are quite clear. And Bjorn Lomborg's done a good job of delineating this, but he's not the only one. If you get poor people up to the point where they're producing $5,000 a year in GDP individually, they start taking a long-term view of their life, which means they turn their attention to things like environmental preservation. And so it seems to me, and I looked into this extremely deeply 10 years ago when this first became obvious to me, that the best pathway forward for environmental sustainability is to eradicate absolute poverty. And the way you do that is with cheap energy. And I've watched the left because I was very curious. I thought, okay, when push comes to shove, will the lefties worship Gaia or continue in service to the poor? And the answer to that's absolutely clear, is they'll sacrifice the poor to their nature worship in no time flat. Yeah. Why? I don't think that the radical psychopathic ideologues on the left and the ones on the right are no better in their own peculiar way. They're not fans of humanity, not in the least. We're cancer on the planet. It'd be a hell of a lot better if there were fewer of us. The natural order would be much better if we'd never evolved, etc., etc. There's an antinatalist element to that. You shouldn't have children because they generate too much carbon dioxide. It's like, no, none of this is acceptable. Yeah. Your identity cannot be anti-human unless you want to be miserable, anxious, hopeless, and disunited. And if you are those things, then a society that isn't those things will demolish you. And see, one of the reasons Dawkins, for example, announced that he was a cultural Christian is because Dawkins, first of all, is terrified of the anti-scientific radicals, and who God only knew that they were going to show up. But he's also terrified of the religious fundamentalists, especially on the Islamic side. And he has reason for that. And if we're weak enough in the West so that we lose our religious foundation, those who are slightly more committed will just brush us away.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And everyone knows that, even if they won't admit it.
There are two more aspects that we have to discuss on identity that seem to be at the core of identity. One is language. Identity is so much about language. And it seems, at least in Europe, the political left has dominated language, the creation of words,
yeah,
the
they're very
creation
good at that.
Of verbal phenomenons. They
gender affirming care.
For example,
yes. How many lies can you pack into 3 years?
You know,
yeah.
So they dominate language. That is one. And on the other side, they try to get us to say things that we know are not true. Mm-hmm. So how can we break out of that? Because that really seems to be, we are caught in their language and they get, conservatives to say things that are not true. Men are women, women are men. How can we break out?
Yeah. Stop doing it.
But there's a high price. You get get devastated.
Right.
You get destroyed. Your life gets destroyed. So how do you break?
Well,
how do you find the courage?
Right. That's a great objection. Well, the first thing you have to understand is that there's no zero price option. You can pay now or you can pay later. And if you pay later, the price you pay, maybe you won't pay it. Maybe your children will pay it. You defer a necessary sacrifice and you end up sacrificing a lot more. So, and I'm dead serious about this. It's like, of course you should be afraid to stand up as an individual to the radical left. Why? Because they'll devastate you with their gossip mongering and their psychopathic, what would you say, reputation savaging, cowardly, anonymous reputation savaging and mobbing. Of course you should be afraid of that. What should you be afraid more of? Losing your tongue, right? Losing your soul. That's way worse. Now, that might be deferred, but you're quite a fool if you think that a deferred sacrifice is going to be less intense. It's not. So you don't find your courage. You get your fears in order. And you should be a lot more afraid of losing the courage to control your own tongue than you should be afraid of anything that the left can throw at you. And I mean, that might be the sacrifice of your reputation, the sacrifice of your job, etc. Now, having said that, get your fears in order. Having said that, you also shouldn't be a fool. You don't throw away everything you have casually. If you're going to stand up and fight, you should have a strategy. Plus, you shouldn't do it alone. So you can be destroyed, but 4 of you probably couldn't be, right? If you guys linked arms. And because it's a lot harder to go after 4 people than 1, like it's kind of exponentially more difficult. And part of the reason we put together this Alliance for Responsible Citizenship was to bring conservatives and classic liberals together from around the world, especially those who were feeling so isolated that they didn't have enough courage to speak. It's like, well, I'm alone. No, you're not. The people that would ally themselves with you are hidden. We want to bring them out into the open and say, no, look, we're the majority and we've got the moral high ground in every fundamental manner, as long as we're willing to pay the appropriate price. It's like, and then we could go back to something that's deeper. See, you have to move through the world with faith. And the reason you have to is because you're ignorant. You don't know everything and you can't compute everything. And so you have to operate in some ways on the basis of principle. Well, here's a good principle. No matter what happens if you tell the truth, it's the best thing that could have happened. Now, you got to think that through. It's the first proposition there is that when the truth makes itself manifest in the world, there's a consequence. Okay, so that consequence is equivalent to the order that is good or the order that's very good that's established at the beginning of time. There's a proposition there. If it stems from the truth, it's the best it can be. Well, you might say, well, that's terrible for me. It's like, it's not as terrible for you as what will happen if you don't tell the truth. That doesn't mean it might not be terrible.
And it's the biggest threat to them.
Look, the best option you might have at the moment is something that's not so good.
Yeah.
That's certainly possible.
But that's why they hate jokes, for example, because they carry truth.
They hate
jokes.
Yes,
humor.
Right. But so you have to decide if you're going to stake yourself on the truth. Well, there's immense advantages to staking yourself on the truth. For example, you're free.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big advantage. It's a victory right then and there. It's like no one has control over your tongue. Well, if the word is divine, and if it's the principle that orders the cosmos, then if you lose your allegiance with the word, you're gone. Well, there's nothing that a radical can bring to bear on you that is a threat that's that significant. It's also the case, practically speaking, if you stop being on the defensive. Like, I'm basically left alone now. And the reason for that, in part, except by the right-wing Nazi trolls who've just emerged in droves again. But the left basically leaves me alone. And part of the reason for that is they've exhausted their artillery.
Yes. It doesn't work anymore.
Well, they pushed it to the limit.
Yes.
It's like when I was accused of being Red Skull, for example, right?
In Germany, they now call everyone a Nazi who disagrees.
Yeah, right.
They use, the hardest possible word, and no one believes it anymore. Coming to words, one of the big attack slogans in their repertoire obviously is diversity.
Yeah.
And diversity obviously fuels what, can be a threat to identity, mass migration. And that is something we see in Europe. That is something we see in the US. It's something that we see all around the Western world. And the presumption here presented by the left is diversity will make us all stronger. We will all be stronger if less and less people have less in common in the future. Why are they doing that?
Well, as James Lindsay says, never forget that it's always about the revolution.
Yeah.
Right. And so whatever sticks can be put in the spokes to bring down the capitalist patriarchy, so much the better, to invert the power hierarchy, right? So it's all variants of that fundamentally usurping theme. But I think part of the way you fight back against that is by pointing out the obvious. It's like, okay, fine, so multiculturalism. All right, so the world's multicultural. Well, has it been peaceful historically? No. I mean, there's been wars between people with different views. Yeah. Oh, I see. So these people are going to magically come to the West, and all that they're going to bring with them is the plethora of benefits that go along with being diverse and none of the pathologies. That's your theory. That's a stupid theory. Right. Well, if the world was peaceful and harmonious, we wouldn't need immigration. It isn't peaceful and harmonious. Why? Because of pathological diversity. Right now, that doesn't mean that diversity as such is pathological, because there's no difference between diversity in a sense and plenty. But you have to be able to discriminate between what's worth conserving and what isn't. And of course, the radical, compassionate psychopaths of the demented left assume that everything is wheat and nothing is chaff. But they do that because they don't want any of their own inadequacies to be identified as chaff. And it's no bloody wonder. So now the conservatives have to stop apologizing. And the left is also very poor at managing the defensive. So if you mount an offense and stop playing defense,
yes,
they just leave.
Yeah.
Right? If you're guilty, if you're backing up,
they will eat your life.
Yeah, at 100. So that's the issue. It's like, maybe it's your turn to speak at your damn job, and the consequence of that is you're going to lose your job. That could be.
Yeah.
You sure you want that job?
Yeah.
Right? I'm dead serious. Because that could be an evidence that occupation has now become so pathological that you can't have the job and your conscience. Well, maybe God's offering you a noble way out. You can stand up, you can lose your job, and you have to prepare for that. Maybe you should always be prepared for that. What's the gospel injunction? When the invitation to the banquet arrives at your door, you're to drop everything and attend the wedding.
Yeah.
Right. It's not time to think, well, you know, I need to keep my job. It's like, do you really?
Yeah.
It's that important to you, is it? You got to figure out what's important.
Just briefly back to mass migration, which is a huge trend we're seeing now all over the Western world. What do you think it does do to the brain, to identity? What does it do to society suddenly, especially from Muslim/Islamist societies? What does it do suddenly having that in, you know, a street that you've known for 30 years and that looks completely different within a year?
Well, in the biblical corpus, there's two kinds of foreigner. All right. There's the foreigner who comes in with poisonous ideas that's just like a plague. It's just devastating. And there's the foreigner who comes in when your culture itself is corrupt and is the only one who has the wisdom to tell you what's wrong. And that is the eternal conundrum that you face when you face a stranger. Like, is this someone who has a wealth of opportunity and wisdom that you could benefit from in ways that are incalculable, or is this the plague itself? And the conservatives tend to tilt more towards the plague interpretation and the liberals more towards the endless opportunity interpretation. And both of them are right some of the time. And so we talk all the time to figure out just exactly what the situation is right now. Okay, if we bring people into a society who are radically different, then the challenge to the axioms of our society are, what would you say, are proportionate to the degree of difference between the cultures. Okay, so maybe England has Polish immigrants. Well, they're Polish with a Judeo-Christian background. Okay, maybe Great Britain has fundamentalist Wahhabi Islam immigrants. Well, the depth of conflict is much greater there, much greater. Okay, it means the ideas that are at stake are much farther down the dependency hierarchy, much more depends on them. And so the price of that radical inclusion is the war between the underlying ethos, and the deeper the war, the more destabilizing it is. Now, there is a possibility of benefit there, because if there's a fundamental conflict and you can resolve it, there can be great opportunity there. But you don't do that casually. And usually that turns into war, right? Which is the historical pattern between Islam and Christianity. Now, we better bloody well hope that's not the only pathway forward.
Why wouldn't it be?
Well, how about the Abraham Accords? They've held even after October 7th. Right. There's a dedicated group on the Islamic side of the world who would like to move towards a future that's peaceful. Could we negotiate that? We did it with the Abraham Accords. So there's an existence proof, and they haven't fallen apart, right? So that's really something.
They've improved throughout the past months, actually.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. So there's some hope there, and there are people in the UAE in particular, although that's not the only place. Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. And the Biden administration could have had the damn Saudis sign that Abraham Accord if they would have been willing to give Trump the iota of credit for pulling off ultimate in peaceful negotiations in the last 70 years. And they refused that out of hand. Yeah. And now we have October 7th, right? Unconscionable, inexcusable, because the Saudis would have signed that agreement.
Yes.
Right. So can there be a rapprochement with the Muslim world? Well, we've been struggling with that for 1,400 years. It's a really big problem. And there are fundamental differences. There is some agreement. Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all people of the book. That's not nothing. There is a shared tradition of sorts, right? There is a tremendous emphasis with the Muslims, at least, on the supremacy of Christ. Now, exactly what that means is subject to great debate, but still there's a core there,
something in common.
Right? There's something there. So, and you hope that people of goodwill can negotiate peacefully, because the alternative is war. And it is the alternative, and you can see that.
Yes.
And the idea that we're not importing that war with this kind of like open-armed invitation to mass migration, that's a fool's hell, fundamentally. Obviously, we're importing that. Obviously. It hasn't been resolved in the least.
You just mentioned both the Biden and the Trump administration, which brings me to the last part of this great interview, which is the big political story of these days. And I know you're a psychologist and not a neurologist, but you know a lot about the human brain. What is your observation of the US president, the state he's in?
Well, I watched the debate and I watched last night's press conference. The debate was not good. I think it's time for Jill and Hunter to take Joe home. I don't think they'll do it. Why do I think that? Well, I watched the debate. I had a bad day. It's like, yeah, you had a bad day. You definitely had a bad day. Was that emblematic? I don't know if you get to have that sort of mistake when you have your finger on the nuclear buttons. I think maybe it's time to bow out. And I don't think you've done such a good job of succession planning either, because it doesn't look to me like Kamala Harris is a viable candidate for the Democrats in the leadership race. I think you have to be demented to think that she is. Yes, and I guess that speaks to the point, isn't it? Doesn't it? There shouldn't be doubt about the president's intellectual competency. Yeah. You know, he's showing signs of age. Well, that's a real problem because he's actually also getting older. And so the debate was theater of the absurd. And in many ways, the press conference last night was too. Like, it could have been worse. It could have, but that's bad enough, isn't it?
That's bad enough for a US president.
Threshold is it could have been worse.
For a nuclear arsenal, it could have been worse. That's not good.
And to confuse Kamala with Trump,
yes,
that's a big mistake. And to confuse Zelensky with Biden, I know he caught it, but that's not the point.
Yes.
So no, it's not good. It's not good. And I think it speaks. It's also really, really not good that everybody's lied about it. That's really not good.
I have a last question, and the very last question I will ask them both together to save you time. One is to identity and what you just described, because, you know, in especially democracies, people want to know who their leaders are. You know, they voted for someone, so they want to know, is he really in charge? Do you think that is something that is in doubt now? Because obviously that man cannot be in charge.
I don't know.
That state.
You know, I don't know if we ever know who's in charge, you know, in some fundamental sense with the presidency, because there are so many, especially in a place as complicated as the United States, it's very difficult to see where the true power lies.
Yes.
And I mean,
but it's becoming obvious right now, right? Because obviously that man is not, you know, they say that, and he's in charge until 8. But what's after 8? Like, is that somehow confirming that feeling, that instinct, that is a lot about identity, that those who are presumably in charge, those who we voted for, are really not, and there's someone behind them?
Well, there are lots of things behind them, and that's actually a plus in some real sense. The president isn't a dictator, and his decision-making capacity should be widely and radically distributed. You still need someone still has to be the place where the buck stops, obviously, and that's in doubt with regards to Biden, and that's a problem. But I think we don't want to confuse the president with a monarch or an absolute dictator. His power is distributed all the time. What you hope, therefore, is that he is the captain of a team of autonomous people, and that he's actually genuinely the captain. And I do think that there's reason to be doubtful about that. So,
you have not only written a new great book, Identitätspolitik, Dr. Peterson, you're also launching something very exciting, which is Peterson Academy.
Yes.
Just tell us about what that is.
We have gathered I'm in a privileged position in many ways, and one of the privileges that I have is that I have access to great minds, and many of whom I bring on as guests to my podcast. And so I can find stellar people, and they're generally almost invariably willing to work with me. We've taken a number of them and recorded the courses they most want to teach, and we've done that in a manner that is stellar on the production side. We are going to offer the best courses in the most efficient format by the best lecturers with the best production quality that have ever been offered. And they're looking really good. The trailers have enough quality to bring a tear to my eye. And that happens with me quite regular anyway, so I don't know what kind of testament that is, but I'm dead serious about that. Like, we really did find the best minds, and these lectures are great, and the production quality is superb. And there's more, because we also set up a social media element to the university, because a lot of what a university is social connection. And we've taken what we believe to be the best of what social media has to offer, and the fact that this will be a somewhat exclusive enterprise, given that it's a subscription platform, should also mean that it'll be a social media network composed of people who are aiming upward and trying to educate themselves. And it'll be a space that isn't dominated by trolls and bots and bad corporate actors. And so that'll launch within the next couple of weeks. And we hope that we can, it's not accredited at the moment. That's a problem that we'll solve one way or another, either by going direct to potential employers or by finding a route to accreditation. There's a variety of ways to solve that problem. We hope that we can offer people a high-level equivalent to a bachelor's degree at 1/20th the price and 10 times the quality. And I think we can do that. It's an opportunity that's laying there waiting, right? Because one of the things that on-demand video allows is it allows us to find the best lectures there are and to bring them to everyone.
And escape debt.
Yes, exactly. Well, and that's right. I mean, we believe my target cost for a 4-year degree equivalent is $4,000. My daughter thinks we can do it for half that.
Yeah.
But, well, that's what we're hoping to do. We'll see. You know, I don't know. It's an open question whether we can make this viable financially, right? Who knows? But I'm extremely happy with the course offerings that we have so far, and with the social media network, the way the platform works, it's stellar. So we're hoping, and there's a huge opportunity in the developing world, right? Because this will open the doors to high-level, humanities-oriented classic education to everyone. And so the median age in Africa is 19, you know, like that's a whole market that's just crying out for.
And they skipped landlines and went straight to the smartphone.
Right, so. Exactly. And it's a useful thing for conservatives to know too. If you're going to win the culture war, no. If you're going to withstand devastation in the culture war, you better pay some attention to education. And so that's what we're doing with Peterson Academy.
Amen. Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson.
You bet. Nice talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Das war eine Sonderausgabe von Schuler. Fragen, was ist ohne Ralf Schuler? Dafür mit Dr. Jordan Peterson. Sehr geehrt, dass er bei uns war. Herzlichen Dank. Vielen Dank, Dr. Peterson.